I remember the sound before I even felt the pain, the thick snap of leather cutting through the air, and then the searing sting across my shoulder that made me flinch. My father, Richard Dawson, 55 years old, stood over me in our cramped Ohio living room with a cracked leather belt clenched in his fist, his face flushed red from bourbon and rage, his breath hot with alcohol as he shouted that I had no right to keep my scholarship money. Beside him stood my mother Margaret, 52, her hands shaking as she clutched the hem of her sweater. Yet when Richard lashed out, she often joined him, and that night was no different. Her palm cracked across my face, her voice sharp and cruel as she shouted the words that still echo in my skull, "Ungrateful child." My head snapped to the side, my cheek stung, and I stumbled backward into the corner of the couch. My brother, David, 25, leaned in the doorway with his arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips because he had always been the golden boy, the one who could do no wrong, the one who got the car, the tuition, the excuses. I was 20, and the scholarship I had earned after endless nights of writing essays and pushing myself to keep grades up was the only ticket I had to escape, but to them it was nothing more than another pile of money to control. Richard's voice thundered, "Hand it over! Every cent belongs to me! You live in my house! You follow my rules!" The walls of the living room seemed to vibrate with his rage, the family pictures rattling slightly in their frames. I clutched the envelope tighter, my fingers trembling, but I raised my chin and forced the words out. "It's mine. I earned it." The moment I said it, the air shifted. Richard's eyes narrowed, his jaw set, and I knew the price of defiance would be blood. The belt came down again, the leather biting into my arm, ripping skin, and before I could gasp, Margaret's hand struck my cheek again, driving me to the floor. My teeth tore the inside of my lip, and warm blood filled my mouth with the taste of iron and bile. Richard towered above me, shouting that I was nothing, that I owed him respect, that without him I was worthless. He raised the belt again, the buckle grazing my temple as I tried to shield myself with trembling arms. Margaret stood beside him, tears streaming down her face, but her voice still hard, repeating the words like a curse, "Ungrateful child." My ribs ached with each blow, and then my chest tightened in a way that was not just pain from the belt. My heart began to race, pounding so loud I could barely hear his words. The rhythm stuttered, surged, then skipped, and a sharp ache shot down my left arm. I gasped, but no air came. The edges of my vision blurred the faded wallpaper and dusty rug spinning around me. David's laughter cut through the haze, a low, cruel sound as he said, "She looks pathetic." The humiliation burned hotter than the bruises. I clawed at the rug, desperate to hold onto something, but my hands slipped, my strength leaking away. Richard crouched close, his face inches from mine, the veins in his eyes broken and red. "You will learn respect if it kills you," he growled. His words seemed to vibrate inside my skull. My chest convulsed, my breath rattled shallow and thin. My heart thumped wildly and then slowed again, a terrifying uneven beat. My mother pressed her hands to her ears but did not move, did not protect me, did not stop him. My body gave out. I collapsed flat against the rug, the dust and old beer stains filling my nostrils. My lips parted with nothing but a rasp. My last sight was Richard's fist still gripping the belt, and Margaret's face twisted as she shouted again, "Ungrateful child." The world blinked into darkness. When light returned, it was fluorescent and merciless. I opened my eyes to the antiseptic sting of a hospital room. A monitor beeped erratically beside me, each sound a reminder that my heartbeat was barely holding rhythm. My chest rose unevenly, every breath a fight. A nurse bent over me, cold instruments pressing against my skin, and her voice urged me not to strain. My lips tried to form words, but only a rasp came out. Then, a man in a white coat stepped forward, flipping through a chart before looking at me. His expression was grave, his eyes heavy. He spoke quietly, as though the words might break me if they were too loud. She might not survive the night. The sentence hung in the sterile room, louder than any of my father's shouts, more final than any strike of the belt. My heart lurched, my chest ached, and all I could think was that my fight to claim even a shred of independence might end here, with strangers deciding whether my pulse would carry me into another morning. When I was 10 years old, everything changed, and the pieces of the girl I thought I could be were scattered across years of silence and fear. Richard had once been a man who held a steady job at the local mill, but when the layoffs came, he lost not only his paycheck, but his pride, and soon after he drowned both in cheap bourbon. The alcohol gave him a cruel kind of confidence, a belief that control and domination were the only things left to prove his worth. My mother Margaret, once gentle and soft-spoken, began to bend under his weight. At first she whispered objections, but those whispers quickly faded until she repeated his words like scripture, telling me that he was the provider that I had to obey, that fighting back only made life worse. I remember sitting in my room listening to their voices through the thin walls, my mother crying, Richard roaring, and eventually the crying would quiet and she would echo him instead of resisting. From then on, it was as if she became his second voice, the one that reinforced his cruelty by nodding along. David, my older brother, never felt the sharp edge of Richard's temper. To him, Richard was generous, indulgent, showering him with gifts, even when bills went unpaid. When David turned 16, he was given a car, while I was told to be grateful if there was enough money for my school shoes. On birthdays, David had cake parties, friends filling the house. On mine, Richard would grunt another year of wasted food and space, and Margaret would say nothing as she cleared the dishes. David's grades did not matter, his mistakes were brushed aside, while every choice I made was scrutinized, every slip turned into proof of my uselessness. At 13, I overheard Richard laughing with a neighbor saying, "Feeding Hannah is like throwing money in the trash. She's just an extra mouth to feed." He repeated it often enough that the phrase became a family joke. Margaret would smirk when he said it. David would snicker and call me extra mouth in the hallways of our house, and soon it followed me to school, where whispers and giggles stung worse than bruises. That label stuck to my skin like tar. The gaslighting became routine. Richard told me I was lucky he'd let me stay under his roof, that he could throw me out any day and no one would take me in. Margaret echoed, "He is right, Hannah. Without him, you would have nothing." Over time, I began to believe them to feel invisible in my own home. Childhood moments blurred into a single thread of fear and invisibility. I loved to write, to curl over a notebook and spill words that built little worlds where girls like me broke free. But Richard despised it. He would snatch my journals, skim the pages, and sneer worthless scribbles. No one pays for poems. Once he burned an entire stack of my notebooks in the backyard, the smoke rising while I bit my lip until it bled, holding back tears because crying only fueled him. Margaret stood behind him, arms folded, telling me it was better this way, that writing distracted me from chores. In school, I tried to disappear, hoping if I was small enough, quiet enough, I could escape notice. But rumors followed me, fueled by David, who spread stories of how pathetic I was, how even my parents wished I had never been born. Teachers sometimes noticed my downcast eyes or trembling hands, but when they asked if I was okay, I lied and said I was just tired. The truth was too heavy, too humiliating, and I knew if Richard discovered I had spoken, the punishment would be worse than anything before. At 15, the control grew tighter. Richard locked away important documents like my social security card and ID, saying he would keep them safe, but really using them to trap me. He told me if I wanted a part-time job, I was forbidden because it would distract from chores. When I won a small prize from a writing contest, he demanded the check, sneering that money belonged to the head of the house. Margaret told me quietly not to resist, whispering, "It is easier this way." By then, I had stopped expecting rescue from her. She was as bound to him as I was, though her chains were fear and habit. I carried the weight of being erased, every word and every look in that house telling me that I was a burden, a mistake, an inconvenience that should have disappeared. Yet a stubborn ember remained inside me, the belief that maybe through my words I could prove I was more than the extra mouth they mocked. That ember was the only thing that kept me from disappearing entirely, though year after year. Richard's fists, Margaret's complicity, and David's mockery tried to snuff it out. By the time I turned 18, leaving felt impossible. Without documents, without money, without a car, with no family support, I was caged in a house that stripped me of dignity day after day. The cruel cycle was set, Richard the ruler, Margaret the enforcer, David the favored son, and me the scapegoat, the girl erased from her own family portrait. The memory of that evening is carved into me like a scar that never fades. Our house smelled of roast meat and smoke because Richard insisted on hosting a family gathering, something he loved, because it gave him an audience for his performance of being the strong father and provider. Relatives filled the living room, cousins whispering, aunts and uncles sipping drinks, laughter rising above the clink of glasses. I stood near the kitchen doorway holding a tray of plates, trying to remain invisible. It never worked. Richard poured himself another drink, his glass already more than half empty, and he leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who thought he owned the world. His eyes landed on me and he smirked before raising his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Feeding Hannah is like burning money." He announced, his tone half joking, half cruel, but entirely intentional. The room went quiet for a moment, a heavy pause where eyes darted toward me, then away, embarrassed to be witnesses. My cheeks burned as though fire had crawled under my skin. Margaret sat beside him, her smile small, nervous, but she did not correct him, did not defend me. Instead, she let out a short laugh as if agreeing was safer than standing against him. David seized the moment, leaning forward with his usual arrogance, and added, "Yeah, extra mouth." The phrase rolled off his tongue easily, like it was a nickname he enjoyed using, and the laughter that followed from some relatives felt like knives cutting into me. I wanted to drop the tray and run, but my legs refused to move. Instead, I lowered my gaze, staring at the plates as if they could shield me. The humiliation was complete. Not only was I worthless in their eyes, I was a punchline. After the meal, I slipped out into the yard, the cold night air biting at my skin. I leaned against the porch railing, trying to breathe my chest tight with shame. Through the window, I could still hear the laughter, the clinking of glasses, and Richard's booming voice. Inside, I was their joke. Outside, I was alone. At school, the next week, the nickname spread. Someone had overheard, or maybe David told his friends, because whispers followed me down the hallway. Extra mouth, they hissed, giggling behind lockers. Notes were left in my desk with the words scrawled in messy ink. I heard it in the cafeteria, in the library, even during gym when I changed shoes. Teachers noticed my hunched shoulders, my silence, but they did not know the source. The humiliation stuck like glue. It was not just that my family despised me, it was that now the entire community seemed to confirm it. Every time Richard mocked me in front of others, every time Margaret stayed silent or laughed along, every time David echoed the insult, the walls around me grew taller. The gaslighting became sharper. When I protested, Richard would snarl that I was too sensitive, that jokes were harmless, that I had no sense of humor. Margaret would add, "It is easier if you do not react." David would smirk, enjoying the role of the favored son who got to watch me crumble. The cycle was endless. At night in my room, I wrote in secret notebooks, trying to put the pain into words, but even those pages felt fragile, as though Richard might storm in and rip them away at any moment. The humiliation was not confined to one evening or one phrase. It became the air I breathed. I learned to expect it to anticipate the moment Richard would turn a casual dinner into a public stage for my degradation. He thrived on the discomfort of others, on the silence of relatives who would not interfere, on the laughter that covered their unease. And always, always, Margaret by his side, eyes down, smile, forced, never stepping in to say, "That is enough." To be gaslighted was to question my own worth. Was I truly a burden? Was I really lucky they had not cast me out already? The words sank deep until sometimes I wondered if they were right, if maybe my existence was nothing but wasted money, wasted breath. Yet deep inside, something rebelled. The sting of humiliation hardened into a quiet anger, an ember that refused to die even when laughter drowned my voice. That ember whispered that someday, somehow, I would make them face the truth of what they had done to me. For now, though, I carried the nickname like an invisible brand, a reminder that in my family's eyes I was not a daughter, but a curse, not a person, but a mouth they regretted feeding. Amid the shadows that wrapped around my life, there was one place where I felt the faintest warmth, and that was in my literature class at the community college. The classroom smelled faintly of chalk dust and old books, and the walls were lined with posters of famous poets whose words had survived centuries. Sitting there, pencil in hand, I felt a small sense of belonging, as though my scribbles could mean something more than wasted paper. It was in that room that Alex Miller became part of my world. He was 21 with a calm presence that contrasted sharply against the chaos of my home. His voice was steady, his posture relaxed, and he treated everyone with a kindness that felt rare. One afternoon, our professor asked us to share short stories we had written. My hands shook as I held the paper, my voice faltering after the first sentence, but Alex leaned slightly toward me and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "Your words matter." The sentence struck deeper than any insult Richard had ever thrown at me. For the first time in years, someone looked at my words not as trash, but as something worth hearing. When I faltered again, Alex gave a small nod, encouraging me to continue, and somehow I finished reading. The class clapped politely, but his smile stayed with me longer than any sound. After class, he walked beside me toward the parking lot. "You have a way of making people see," he said, and though my instinct was to shrink to brush it off, I whispered a thank you. He did not press, did not demand more, just let the silence between us rest softly, unlike the suffocating silence of my home. Over the weeks, he noticed details others missed. He saw the way I flinched when someone slammed a book down too hard, the way my hands trembled when I gave a presentation, the way I always wore long sleeves even when the heat outside made everyone else sweat. He never questioned directly, perhaps sensing I was not ready to speak, but his steady presence was its own form of protection. One day during class, a debate grew heated, voices rising, and I instinctively shrank into myself. Alex reached out his hand, brushing lightly against my arm, a grounding touch that calmed the storm inside me. My heart raced, but not with fear, with something almost foreign, a fragile sense of safety. That small moment carried me through the long nights at home. At the dinner table, Richard barked orders. Margaret nodded along. David rolled his eyes and muttered insults, and I kept silent, retreating into myself. Yet tucked in the corner of my mind was the memory of Alex's words, "Your words matter." It gave me courage to keep writing, even if only in secret. The contrast between school and home became sharper. In class, I could breathe, I could imagine a future, I could hear encouragement. At home, I was erased, mocked, controlled. The two worlds clashed inside me, but the glimmer of hope refused to die. I began to look forward to literature class, not only for the stories, but for the chance to see Alex's steady gaze, to hear his gentle voice, to feel that maybe I was not as invisible as Richard claimed. Sometimes in the library, Alex sat across from me reading his own work while I scribbled furiously in my notebook. He did not interrupt, did not pry, just created a quiet companionship that allowed me to exist without fear. For someone who had been erased at home, that simple act of being seen was almost revolutionary. It was not love yet, not the kind sung in songs or written in novels, but it was the seed of something tender, a reminder that kindness existed, that perhaps one day I could be part of a life built on respect rather than fear. That seed became my secret, something I held close to my heart when Richard's voice thundered and Margaret's silence suffocated. It reminded me that beyond the walls of my family's house, there was a world where people could choose to care, and that maybe, just maybe, I was worthy of being cared for. Dot. The letter arrived on a gray afternoon when the sky threatened rain, and for a brief moment I felt the world tilt toward possibility. The envelope bore the crest of the state scholarship committee, and when I tore it open, my hands shook with something dangerously close to joy. $2,000, a small sum compared to the grand things David received, but to me, it was freedom stitched onto paper. It was the chance to pay for another semester, the chance to keep my dream of writing alive, the chance to imagine a future beyond Richard's suffocating rule. I tucked the letter between the pages of my notebook, planning to hide it carefully in my room, but secrets never stayed hidden long in our house. Margaret was cleaning or pretending to clean when she found the envelope. Her voice trembled as she called out, "Richard, look what she has been hiding." The word hiding was laced with accusation, as though ambition itself was a sin. Richard snatched the letter from her hand, his eyes scanning the words before narrowing dangerously. He stood in the center of the kitchen, his shoulders squared, his breath already reeking of whiskey. "So, you think you can keep secrets from me?" He growled, his voice low but sharp enough to slice the air. "All money is mine. Everything that comes into this house belongs to me." He crumpled the paper in his fist, the sound of hope crunching under his grip. I felt heat flood my face, a surge of courage rising from somewhere I did not know existed. My body trembled, my heart pounded, but I forced the words out anyway. I earned it. "It's mine." The silence that followed was brief, heavy, and then the storm broke. Richard's roar filled the kitchen.
"What did you just say to me?"
He stepped forward, his shadow falling over me, and his hand lashed out before I could retreat. The slap snapped my head to the side, but I stayed standing. Margaret gasped but did not intervene. David, lounging in the doorway, laughed as though it were entertainment. I tasted blood on my lip, but my voice rose again, defiant though trembling. "It's mine." The fury that flooded Richard's face was almost inhuman. He grabbed the belt from where it hung on the chair, the same cracked leather that had left marks across my skin countless times, and he swung. The buckle grazed my shoulder, leaving a burning line. I staggered back, colliding with the counter, but before I could recover, Margaret's hand struck me across the cheek. Her voice broke into a shriek, "Ungrateful child." The words were spit like venom, not just echoing Richard's cruelty, but amplifying it. My knees buckled and I collapsed to the floor, the cold linoleum unforgiving beneath me. Richard towered over me, his belt raised, his curses raining down. Margaret stood behind him, trembling, yet complicit, her silence turning into active participation. With every word she shouted, every strike she allowed. David's smirk widened as he leaned casually against the doorway, his arms folded, his eyes glittering with cruel amusement. The blows came again and again, each one stealing my breath, each one hammering against the fragile hope that letter had sparked. My chest ached, my ribs screamed, my vision blurred, but somewhere inside me a stubborn flame refused to go out. The words I had dared to say, "It's mine," repeated in my head like a mantra, even as pain threatened to erase everything else. Finally, Richard's arm slowed his chest, heaving his face slick with sweat. He dropped the crumpled letter onto the floor beside me as though it were trash. "You are nothing without me," he spat before storming toward the living room. Margaret lingered for a moment, her lips pressed tight, her eyes darting to my broken form. For the briefest second, I thought she might kneel beside me, might whisper comfort, but instead she turned away, muttering, "Why do you provoke him?" and followed after Richard. David chuckled softly before leaving as well, the sound lingering like a cruel echo. I lay there on the kitchen floor, my cheek pressed against the cold tile, blood trickling from the corner of my mouth, my chest rising in shallow, painful breaths. The scholarship letter, crumpled and smeared, lay inches from my hand. I reached for it, my fingers brushing the paper, clinging to it even in its ruined state. The rain outside finally broke, pounding against the windows, drowning out the last of Richard's curses. I closed my eyes, the sound of the storm mixing with the pounding of my heart, and I understood that the spark of defiance I had ignited would either destroy me or save me. There was no turning back now. When I opened my eyes again, the world was white and sterile, the ceiling lights buzzing faintly above me, the smell of antiseptic filling my nose. My chest ached with every breath, shallow and uneven, and the steady beep of a monitor reminded me that my heart was struggling to keep rhythm. A nurse leaned over, adjusting tubes, her expression professional but worried. I tried to move, but a sharp pain shot through my ribs, forcing me to gasp. The door opened and a doctor stepped in, the clipboard in hand, his eyes scanning the chart before resting on me. He spoke quietly to the nurse, his tone serious. "Injuries inconsistent with a fall," he said, not realizing I could hear. Margaret was in the corner, arms crossed tightly, her face pale but her jaw set. When the doctor asked what had happened, she answered quickly. "She tripped on the stairs. She is clumsy." Her voice was too sharp, too rehearsed. The doctor frowned, scribbled something down, then looked at me directly.
"Is that true?"
he asked. My mouth was dry, my throat raw, but fear pressed down heavier than pain. Richard's shadow lingered in my mind, his threats echoing. I swallowed hard and whispered yes. The lie tasted bitter, but I was too afraid to do otherwise. The doctor did not look convinced. He nodded slowly, but his eyes stayed on me as though silently telling me he knew. Later, a police officer came asking questions, his uniform crisp, his pen ready. Again, Margaret spoke first, repeating the story of the stairs. I nodded weakly, the fear of what Richard would do if I spoke the truth, silencing me. The officer left with a polite nod, but I caught the way he glanced back at me, suspicious. When Margaret finally left the room to make a phone call, I was alone with my pain. My body throbbed, but worse was the sense of being trapped. If I kept silent, nothing would change. But if I spoke, I feared it would only get worse. As tears slipped down my cheeks, I heard a knock at the door. Alex stepped in, clutching a bouquet of simple wildflowers. His face fell when he saw me hooked to Machine's bruises painting my skin in purple and blue. He set the flowers on the table and sat carefully in the chair beside my bed. For a long moment he said nothing, his hand hovering near mine but not touching until I nodded faintly. His fingers wrapped around mine warm and steady. His voice was soft but filled with conviction. "They can't erase you. I'll help." The words broke something inside me, and a sob escaped before I could stop it. No one had ever said that before. No one had ever promised to stand beside me. In that moment, the ember inside me flared small but alive. That night, after Margaret left the hospital, I pulled the thin blanket tighter and made a decision. Silence would kill me. Resistance might save me. I remembered the old phone hidden in my room at home, the one without service but still able to record. I would use it. I would record Richard's rages, his threats, his fists pounding the walls. I would write every detail in a journal marking dates, times, bruises. I would gather proof piece by piece until the truth was undeniable. The plan gave me a strange sense of control, dangerous but necessary. The next morning I was discharged, Margaret driving me home in silence. She muttered once, "Do not make things harder than they already are," but I stared out the window, clinging to my secret resolve. That evening, Richard barked from his chair demanding dinner, his voice thick with drink. My body flinched, but my mind stayed focused. I kept my head down, answered politely, and when he launched into a tirade about my worthlessness, I slipped my hand into my pocket and pressed record on the phone I had hidden there. His voice filled the tiny device every insult captured. Later in my room, I examined the bruises on my ribs in the mirror, lifted my shirt, and took photos with the dim light of a lamp. I tucked the phone and memory card under a loose floorboard. Each act felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, a dangerous rebellion disguised as obedience. Outwardly, I was the same quiet daughter, nodding, apologizing, completing chores. Inwardly, I had begun to fight back. The fear never vanished, but alongside it grew determination. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a weapon not of violence, but of truth, a weapon that might one day set me free. The summer heat pressed heavy on the small Ohio street cicadas screaming from the trees while I dragged a bag of trash toward the bins at the edge of the yard. My ribs still ached with every step, and the bruises along my arms were fading but not gone. Richard was drinking again that afternoon, the sharp smell of bourbon drifting from the porch where he sat like a king on a crumbling throne. His voice carried across the yard, loud and accusing. "You think you are too good for this family, don't you? Taking scholarships, keeping secrets?" He rose suddenly, his chair scraping against the wood, and in a few strides he was beside me, his hand clamped around my arm, his fingers digging so hard I knew they would leave purple marks by morning. He shook me until my teeth rattled. "You are nothing but a burden," he spat, his face inches from mine. I tried to pull away the bag of trash falling to the ground, but his grip tightened. The world tilted as he shoved me, and I stumbled hard against the dirt, my knees scraping my palms, stinging. For a moment, all I could hear was the blood pounding in my ears. Then another voice cut through the haze. "Richard, stop. I'm calling the cops." I lifted my head and saw Evelyn Harper, our 62-year-old neighbor, standing at the fence. Her gray hair was tied back, her hands gripping the wooden slats with surprising strength, her eyes sharp and unflinching. She had lived next door for years, always polite but distant, yet in that moment she was fierce. Richard turned, his face darkening with rage. "Family matter." "Shut your mouth," he growled, his voice low and threatening. Evelyn did not flinch. She held his gaze, her chin lifted, her eyes steady. For a heartbeat, the yard was silent except for the buzzing cicadas, the air thick with tension. Richard finally released me with a shove, muttering curses under his breath as he stomped back toward the house. My knees throbbed, my palms bled, but my heart pounded for a different reason. Someone had seen. Evelyn's gaze softened when it met mine. She did not smile, did not pity me, but there was recognition, as though she understood more than I had ever admitted aloud. Slowly, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a small piece of folded paper, and slipped it through the gap in the fence. "Call me any time," she said simply, her voice low but firm. Then she turned and walked back to her porch, leaving me with the slip of paper clutched tightly in my hand. I tucked it quickly into my pocket before Richard could notice my chest tight with a mixture of fear and fragile relief. That night, I sat in my room, the lamp casting shadows on the walls, and unfolded the paper. A phone number written in careful handwriting stared back at me. The words beneath it were simple but powerful. "You are not alone." I pressed the paper to my chest, tears stinging my eyes. For the first time in years, there was someone beyond the walls of my prison who knew someone who had seen someone who had not turned away. The knowledge did not erase the bruises, did not silence Richard's threats, but it carved a small opening in the suffocating darkness. In the days that followed, I carried that paper everywhere, hidden deep in my pocket or tucked into my journal. I did not call, not yet, fear still too strong, but the lifeline was there, a reminder that escape might be possible. Outwardly, nothing changed. Richard still barked orders. Margaret still echoed his cruelty, David still mocked. But inwardly, I clung to that folded paper as fiercely as I clung to my secret recordings. The cage around me had cracks now, cracks where light seeped in, cracks that whispered maybe someday I could walk free. It was a week after Evelyn had slipped me that folded piece of paper when the house once again became a battlefield. The day had begun quietly, almost deceptively so, with Richard slumped in his chair watching the muted television, while Margaret busied herself with laundry. I had spent the morning clutching a letter I had received in the mail, a new invitation to interview for an extended scholarship that could cover nearly all of my next semester's tuition. The letter felt like a golden key, a fragile but real escape route. I tucked it between the pages of my notebook, the same hiding place I had used before. But Richard had an uncanny ability to sniff out hope. By evening, he was standing in the hallway, waving the letter in his fist, his eyes bloodshot, his breath heavy with drink. "What is this?" he roared, shaking the paper. "You dare to make plans without me? You dare to keep this secret in my house?" His voice reverberated against the walls, every word dripping with rage. Margaret appeared at his side almost instantly, her face pale but her voice sharp. "Ungrateful child," she hissed as though my desire to study was a personal betrayal of her loyalty to him. My stomach dropped, but I forced myself to stand tall. "It is my future," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "It is mine." Richard's roar filled the house. He lunged forward, grabbing my arm and yanking so hard my shoulder screamed in pain. He slammed me against the wall, the plaster cracking under the force, and raised his belt. Margaret's hands were on me next, not pulling him back but holding my wrists so I could not shield myself. Her voice rose into a shriek. "Ungrateful child! You embarrass this family!" The betrayal cut deeper than the blows. Richard swung the belt again and again, the buckle grazing my temple, my ribs crying out with each strike. My vision blurred stars dancing before my eyes. David stood at the edge of the hallway, his arms folded, his grin wide. At first he laughed, muttering that I deserved it, but when I crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath, his laughter faltered. For a moment his eyes widened, fear flickering across his smug face, but he did nothing to stop it. The strikes continued, the words poured out, and my body began to fold under the weight. My chest seized my heart, pounding erratically fast and then frighteningly slow. I clawed weakly at the floor, trying to push myself up, but Margaret's grip forced me down again. The room, tilted voices blurred until finally I collapsed entirely. I remember the cold linoleum against my cheek, the coppery taste of blood in my mouth, the roaring in my ears fading into silence. When I opened my eyes again, fluorescent lights blinded me. I was in the hospital once more, machines beeping the scent of antiseptic in the air. A doctor leaned over me, his brow furrowed. "She is lucky to be alive," he murmured to a nurse. Margaret was beside the bed, her hands folded, her voice steady as she repeated the same lie. She tripped on the stairs. "She is clumsy." The doctor's frown deepened. "These injuries do not match a fall," he said firmly. Margaret stiffened her lips tight, but she repeated the story with conviction as though rehearsed. When the doctor turned to me, asking gently if it was true, fear clamped my throat shut. Richard's threats echoed in my head, the promise of worse if I betrayed him. I forced a nod, the lie searing as it left me. The doctor scribbled in the chart, clearly unconvinced, but did not press further. Later, when Margaret stepped out to speak with a nurse, I slipped my hand into my pocket and felt the small USB drive I had managed to hide before collapsing. It contained recordings of Richard's rages, his threats, his curses. I had tucked it under the rug in my room earlier, but in a moment of clarity, I had moved it into my pocket before the beating. Now it was my lifeline proof that could outlast my fear. I clutched it tight, the edges biting into my palm, a reminder that even in the depths of betrayal, I had not been entirely erased. Back at home, the silence between Margaret and me grew heavier. She avoided my eyes, her guilt buried under her obedience to Richard. David hovered uneasily, torn between loyalty to his parents and the realization that what he had witnessed had gone too far. Richard swaggered through the house as though nothing had happened, demanding dinners, barking orders, his belt still draped over the back of his chair like a trophy. The betrayal stung worse than the bruises. Margaret had not only stayed silent, she had held me down, her voice joining his in cruelty. That image replayed in my mind every time I closed my eyes. The world inside me shifted. The ember of resistance flared hotter. If my own mother would betray me to protect him, then I had no reason left to protect her silence. I would gather every recording, every journal entry, every photograph. I would make sure the truth could no longer be buried under lies about stairs. The fear was still there, wrapping tight around my ribs, but alongside it burned fury. The night I returned home, I lay in bed, the USB drive clutched in my hand, and whispered to myself, "They cannot erase me. Not anymore." It was a vow born of blood and betrayal, a vow that no matter how many times Richard swung that belt, no matter how many times Margaret hissed those words someday, their cruelty would be dragged into the light dot. The breaking point came quickly, like a storm that had been gathering for years and finally crashed through the walls of our house. Richard had been drinking since noon, his voice booming through the living room, demanding to know where his wallet money had gone. He accused me of stealing his words slurred but sharp, and when I denied it, he lunged across the room and struck me so hard I collapsed against the coffee table. Margaret shrieked not in defense, but in accusation, shouting again that I was an ungrateful child who wanted to ruin the family. David stood frozen in the corner, his fists clenched, but still he did nothing. I tasted blood in my mouth as Richard dragged me up by the arm, shaking me violently. The room spun, my ribs screamed, but I clutched my backpack against me, hiding the recorder I had managed to switch on before his rage erupted. His voice thundered into the small device, every insult, every threat captured clearly. When he finally released me, I staggered toward my room, slipping the USB drive beneath the loose floorboard and tucking the recorder deeper into my bag. My chest heaved, my heartbeat erratic, but my mind focused on survival. That evening, a knock rattled the front door. Margaret rushed to answer, but it was Evelyn standing tall on the porch, 2 police officers at her side. Richard tried to mask his surprise, straightening his shirt and forcing a smile. "Officers, what seems to be the problem?" His tone was slick, almost polite, but his eyes were sharp. Evelyn stepped forward, her gaze fixed on me where I stood in the hallway, bruises fresh across my face. Her voice was firm. "I heard enough. This girl needs protection." One of the officers asked if everything was all right. Richard barked that it was a family matter that Evelyn was interfering, but before he could continue, Evelyn pulled a small flash drive from her pocket. "This is what I recorded," she said. The officer plugged it into a laptop, and suddenly Richard's voice filled the room, his drunken rants echoing. "Ungrateful child! You are nothing without me!" The sound of a slap followed clear and undeniable. Margaret gasped, David paled, and Richard lunged forward, shouting that it was fake, but the officers stepped between them. My hands shook as I reached into my backpack and produced the recorder. My own voice played through its speaker, weak but steady, as I described dates, bruises, threats. The evidence spoke louder than my trembling body ever could. David stammered, trying to defend Richard, but one officer silenced him, pointing to Margaret. "Ma'am, is this true?" Margaret broke, then her shoulders shaking, tears streaming down her face. "It is true," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Everything she said is true." Evelyn wrapped an arm around me as Richard shouted curses, his hands grasping the air as the officers cuffed him. Cold metal clicked around his wrists, and the man who had ruled our house with fists and fear was dragged through the doorway in front of neighbors who had gathered outside, drawn by the flashing lights. Murmurs spread through the crowd, disbelief mixing with relief. Richard Dawson, once the feared head of the house, was now just another criminal shoved into the back of a police car. Margaret was taken into custody as well, charged with obstruction and accessory after her lies at the hospital. David was questioned separately, his role as silent witness finally forcing him to face consequences. At the hospital later that night, detectives sat beside my bed as I recounted everything. My voice trembled, but I forced the words out, describing years of humiliation, nights of rage, the cycle of abuse that had nearly ended my life. They listened intently, nodding, assuring me the case was strong. When the trial began, weeks later, the courtroom was packed. I stood at the witness stand, my hands shaking, but my voice clear as I told the jury how my father had beaten me, how my mother had held me down, how they had tried to erase me. The recordings played on the large screen, Richard's voice filling the chamber, his fists striking in frame. Margaret's lies were revealed. David's silence dissected Evelyn's testimony, strong and unwavering. The doctors testified, explaining that my injuries could never have been caused by a simple fall. Each word, each piece of evidence stacked against them until their power evaporated. Richard glared at me from the defense table, his eyes blazing with hatred, but his voice no longer carried weight. The jury returned swiftly. Guilty on all counts, Richard was sentenced to 15 years for attempted murder and felony domestic violence. Margaret received 7 years for accessory and obstruction. David was placed on probation with mandatory counseling, his complicity recognized, but his chance for redemption offered. The judge's gavel struck, and the sound was like a door slamming shut on years of terror. In that moment, the cage that had bound me cracked open, and the air rushed in sharp and sweet. Justice had finally stepped through the doorway of our home, and for the first time I was not invisible. When the trial ended and the courtroom emptied, I felt as though I had stepped out of a storm into a silence I had never known. The air outside was crisp, the sky wide, and for the first time in years I was able to take a breath that did not taste of fear. Richard was gone, locked behind bars where his fists could no longer reach me, his voice stripped of power. Margaret, too, was gone, her silence and her lies finally held accountable, her tears no longer a shield. David had been handed probation and counseling, a chance to confront his complicity, though whether he would ever truly change, I could not know. I moved into Evelyn's small house next door, a modest place that smelled of lavender and lemon. She left the porch light on every night, telling me it would guide me back, no matter how dark the world became. The first nights were hard. I woke, drenched in sweat, Richard's roar echoing in my head, my chest tight with phantom blows. Evelyn would sit with me, her hand steady on mine, reminding me I was safe. Slowly, my body began to believe her. Alex visited often, bringing books and sometimes flowers, sometimes nothing more than his quiet presence. He sat beside me on the porch, reading aloud in a voice that soothed the raw edges of my mind. One evening, as the sun set, he reached for my hand, his touch gentle, his words soft. "They broke bones," he said, his eyes meeting mine, "but not your spirit." Tears filled my eyes at the truth of it, and for the first time I let myself lean into the warmth of someone who cared. The bruises faded, the cuts healed, but the scars inside remained. I poured them into words, writing late into the night, my blog filling with stories of survival. At first, I posted anonymously, my voice cautious, but soon readers appeared, survivors who left comments telling their own stories, thanking me for sharing mine. Each message reminded me that I was not alone, that my words had power, that healing was not just possible, but real. The blog grew a small community of voices rising together, and for the first time, I felt my writing had purpose beyond escape. Months passed, and when the sentencing was read in the courthouse, I stood again, my voice steady. They tried to erase me. I said my words echoing in the chamber, but today I am heard. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras clicked, but I spoke not for them, but for myself, for the girl who had once cowered under fists and insults. The words felt like freedom, like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. At Evelyn's house, the rhythm of life softened. We cooked together, we planted flowers in her small garden, and in the evenings Alex would join us, laughter filling spaces once drowned in rage. There were still moments of darkness memories that clung, but each day I reclaimed more of myself. One night I sat on the porch, pen in hand, notebook open, the warm glow of the lamp spilling across the page. Alex brought out 2 cups of tea, setting one beside me, his smile quiet but full of understanding. I looked at him at the safety of Evelyn's porch, at the notebook that no one would ever burn, and I realized healing was not an end, but a journey. Justice had been served, the truth had been spoken, and love had begun to take root in the ashes. My story had begun with fists and blood, but it did not end there. It ended with justice, with healing, with the promise of a future where my words mattered, where my voice was no longer silenced. And as the night deepened and the porch light glowed, I knew one thing with certainty. I had survived. I had been heard. And I would never again be erased.